So let's go live to the Commons now and speak to Tory MPs Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates. Hello to both of you. Obviously, a huge disappointment, although we've all read Suella Braverman's letter and we know that she says she was trying to tee the Prime Minister up to take the action that she says was needed to know what to do if the fateful decree that was passed today was passed. So let's start with you, Danny. What happens next, if anything? Do we just draw a line under £140 billion and Rwanda, the name Rwanda, never uttered again in the House of Commons, or are we meant to find some other way forward? And we can't hear a word that you're saying. Can we hear you now?
The court was...
Great, carry on. Sorry,
How's that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
OK, so very... I'll keep going. Very disappointed by the judgment, but encouraged that the government seems committed to proceeding with Rwanda, and most of all that they understand we need to review our international and our domestic legal framework, which has given the courts the reason to find in the way they have today. We obviously need a stronger arrangement with Rwanda, which I understand will now proceed, but more profoundly we need to look at the whole framework of international human rights. The treaties themselves, the European Convention, the Refugee Convention, the text of these treaties is fine and very good and noble. We should be proud to sign up to those principles. The problem is the way they're applied by the courts, both in Europe and here in the UK. And our view is that we need to, if necessary, withdraw altogether. But in the short term, we certainly need to bring forward emergency legislation which will ensure that people cannot bring claims under these conventions, that will stop the implementation of the bill and the law that was passed here in Parliament to insist that illegal migrants could be removed.
Miriam Cates, is this all somewhat notional? Lee Kane said the plane should have just taken off anyway. Nobody should bother listening to the Supreme Court. The plane should have packed itself full of migrants and illegal migrants and just gone off to Rwanda regardless.
Sorry, my sound's not brilliant, but I think, Lee, of course, is speaking for himself, and we all agree that the planes should take off as quickly as possible. And the question is, technically, how do we make that possible? And we probably will need some form of emergency legislation to show that UK Parliament has sovereignty over our borders, to make clear that for the purposes of the illegal migration bill, at the very least, these notwithstanding purposes for the conventions that we're talking about, that we don't have to follow those conventions for the purposes of the deterrent effect of the Rwanda policy. So I think we all realise this is a very serious moment for our party, also for the country as a whole. We've pledged that we will end this crisis, that we will stop the boats, that we will take back control of our laws. And the judgment today is a big step back. So we're very much looking forward to hear what the Prime Minister has to say as how we're going to quickly get back on track and stop the boats.
Suella Braverman has just tweeted, deep breath, everybody, what you're going to say next. She's just said that emergency legislation ought to be implemented urgently to distance us from the European Court of Human Rights. When you talk about emergency legislation, what do you mean by it? Because I think for most people watching and listening at home, this has got incredibly technical. It's taken a long time to reach this stage of technically incomprehensible jargon, really, for most people.
Yes, it is very complicated. Well, essentially, we've got to the point where the Houses of Parliament, so both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, have passed a piece of legislation that says that it is UK law that when people arrive in this country illegally, so mostly we're talking about on small boats, we can illegally deport them to a third country, in this case Rwanda, for processing. Now, that is the will of the Parliament, the elected House of Commons on the basis of the 2019 election. But the court have said that because of a whole range of international obligations and treaties, that the UK Parliament is not allowed to have its way, essentially. So that's what has been said today. So now the ball is back in our court as the government and as Parliament to work out how on earth we are going to apply the primacy of the Parliament over and above the court. And that is really what we're waiting to hear from the Prime Minister as to how that's going to happen. And we do think that that will require emergency legislation so that in the instances of the Rwanda plan, we can disregard those treaties. So that's what we're looking forward to hear from the Prime Minister very shortly.
Danny Kruger, it's Peter Cardwell here. I'm TalkTV's chief political commentator. I wonder if I could ask you, as someone who was, of course, the political secretary to Boris Johnson, someone who really understands the nature of political risk. This is going to dominate the next year. This is a policy that Rishi Sunak perhaps didn't necessarily want. It involves only a few hundred people when there were more people who came across perhaps on Sundays, boats, to Calais than even would be sent to Rwanda in its entirety. Why bother with this? It's a huge political risk.
Well, we were elected on a promise to restore control of our borders and our laws. This is absolutely foundational to our democracy. It's what the public voted for in 2016 and again in 2019. So we are absolutely obliged to fulfill that foundational democratic imperative. And I don't think this is something that the Prime Minister didn't want. He recognised the importance of it himself at the time. He's made stopping the boats an absolute priority because it's right. It's what the public want, and it's what everybody can see. It's what other countries, by the way, around the world are grappling with. We're in an age of mass migration, of huge flows of people entering countries, in many cases illegally. Countries have to respond to this. Many countries around the world are recognising that the way to do this is to process illegal migrants offshore and to remove them to countries where they can be more safely managed. And so it's quite right that the Prime Minister is committed to this. He'll, I'm sure, be trying to fulfil his obligation and his promise to stop the boats. I think it's very, very difficult, but we think that the plan is there. When the Illegal Migration Act was going through Parliament in the last session, we tried to strengthen it with an amendment to ensure that people could not bring claims under human rights legislation to stop their removal. This is fundamentally a matter for the government. So we think it can be done. It's going to take a lot of courage, and there'll be, I'm afraid to say, a lot of people inside and outside Parliament who will resist it. But we know what the public think, and they're right, that the British Parliament should have control of our borders and our laws. That is absolutely essential, and we've got to deliver it.
Well, thank you both very much indeed for joining me.